Targeted individuals, people claiming constant surveillance and harassment. There's a growing community of people across the world who share a disturbing set of experiences they claim are ruining their lives. They report being under constant surveillance by unknown agencies or groups, experiencing electronic harassment through technologies they can't identify, hearing voices or sounds that no one else perceives, finding evidence that their homes have been entered and items moved or tampered with while they were away, and suffering coordinated harassment from strangers in public who seem to be following scripts designed to intimidate or destabilize them psychologically. They call themselves targeted individuals, or TIs, and they've found each other through online communities where thousands share remarkably similar stories, despite living in different countries, having different backgrounds, and claiming to have no connection to each other before becoming targeted. The phenomenon raises profoundly difficult questions about the nature of their experiences. Are these people victims of sophisticated, organized harassment campaigns, using advanced surveillance technology, or are they experiencing shared delusions, patterns of mental illness that manifest in similar ways across different individuals because of common psychological mechanisms and the reinforcement effects of online communities where people validate each other's paranoid beliefs? The answer matters enormously, both for how we respond to their suffering and for what their experiences might reveal about surveillance capabilities, psychological warfare techniques, or the nature of certain mental health conditions in the digital age. The typical TI narrative follows certain patterns. The targeting often begins suddenly, sometimes after a specific incident that the person identifies as triggering: whistleblowing, political activism, a conflict with an employer or neighbor, or sometimes with no identifiable cause at all. They begin noticing things: strangers who appear repeatedly in different locations, vehicles that seem to follow them, people on the street who make gestures or comments that feel directed at them, technology behaving strangely in ways that suggest remote manipulation. The harassment escalates over time, becoming more overt and more distressing, expanding from street theater, the term TIs use for coordinated public harassment, into their homes through electronic means, through neighbors who participate in noise campaigns, or through wall harassment, through voice-to-skull technology that they claim can project sounds or voices directly into their heads. The consistency of reports across the TI community is striking. People who've never communicated before, discovering the community, describe identical types of harassment: organized stalking by groups of people, vehicles with specific colors following them, strangers coughing or making clicking sounds as they pass, directed energy weapons causing pain or illness, V2K, or voice-to-skull transmissions that sound like thoughts, but that the individual recognizes as external. The similarity could indicate that these are real tactics being deployed, that there's an actual playbook for psychological operations that multiple agencies or groups are using against targeted populations. Or the similarity could reflect the way certain mental illnesses manifest, patterns that repeat because human psychology and neurology produce consistent symptoms, with the internet allowing people experiencing these symptoms to find each other and collectively develop a shared framework that interprets their experiences through the targeting narrative rather than through mental health frameworks. The technology TIs describe being used against them includes real systems that exist in documented form, alongside alleged capabilities that aren't publicly confirmed. Directed energy weapons, lasers, microwave emitters, acoustic devices, are real technologies with military and law enforcement applications. Active denial systems that use millimeter waves to create intense heat sensation have been developed for crowd control. Long-range acoustic devices can project painful sound at specific targets. These technologies demonstrate that remote influence and harassment is technically possible, though the miniaturized, portable versions that TIs claim are being used against them in residential settings aren't commercially available or easily accessible. Voice-to-skull technology is more controversial. The Frey effect, where microwave pulses can create audible perception directly in the human head, is real and documented science. Patents exist for technologies that could theoretically project sound to specific individuals. But whether functional, targetable, long-range V2K systems exist that could be deployed against civilians without massive, obvious equipment is disputed. TIs claim to experience voices, sounds, or synthetic thoughts that feel externally generated. But these symptoms also match descriptions of auditory hallucinations associated with schizophrenia and other psychotic disorders, creating an evidentiary problem where the claimed harassment and the symptoms of certain mental illnesses produce indistinguishable, subjective experiences. The surveillance that TIs report ranges from plausible to implausible. Being followed, having one's communications monitored, having GPS tracked. These are all technically feasible and have been documented in stalking cases, corporate espionage, and government surveillance programs. But TIs also claim capabilities that strain credibility. Real-time tracking regardless of precautions, reading thoughts or subvocalizations, seeing through walls to monitor activity inside homes, manipulating dreams or memories. Either surveillance technology is far more advanced than publicly acknowledged, or the perception of surveillance exceeds its actual scope, with the psychological state of believing you're being watched creating hypervigilance that interprets normal events as evidence of monitoring. The organized stalking or gang stalking component describes coordinated harassment by multiple people, acting in concert to destabilize the target. In documented cases, organized stalking has occurred. Domestic abuse situations where an abuser mobilizes friends and family to harass a victim. Corporate campaigns against whistleblowers, or harassment by extremist groups. These real instances demonstrate that coordinated group harassment happens. But TIs typically describe operations involving dozens or hundreds of participants, strangers who've been recruited or hired to follow them, neighbors who've been induced to participate in harassment campaigns, and infrastructure that seems implausibly large and well-coordinated to sustain against individuals who often aren't prominent or threatening, in ways that would justify such resource expenditure. The psychological perspective identifies targeted individual experiences as consistent with persecutory delusions, a category of symptoms appearing in schizophrenia, delusional disorder, and other conditions. These disorders can produce absolute conviction that one is being surveilled and harassed despite lack of objective evidence, can create interpretation patterns where ambiguous events are coded as intentional harassment, and can generate auditory hallucinations that the person experiences as external communication rather than internal generation. The internet and TI communities then provide validation and elaborate framework that reinforces these beliefs, makes the person less likely to seek psychiatric help, and deepens the conviction that their experiences are real and externally generated, rather than symptoms requiring treatment. But dismissing all TI reports as mental illness is problematic for several reasons. First, it's patronizing and potentially gaslighting. If someone is experiencing genuine harassment and reporting, it produces psychiatric diagnosis. Rather than investigation, the system becomes another tool of their victimization. Second, we know from declassified programs like COINTELPRO, MKUltra, and various surveillance abuses that governments have conducted operations against civilians that included psychological warfare, harassment, and experimentation. Dismissing all claims as delusion could mean missing real victims of continuing programs. Third, the diagnosis of delusion itself can be circular. The person claims they're being harassed. Investigators find no evidence, therefore they must be delusional. But lack of found evidence doesn't prove absence of harassment, given how sophisticated surveillance and psychological operations could be. The challenge of helping TIs is significant, regardless of whether their experiences stem from external harassment or internal psychological conditions. If they're genuinely being targeted, they need protection and investigation. If they're experiencing mental health crises, they need treatment. But TIs typically resist psychiatric framing of their experiences, having often tried to report their harassment to police or other authorities and been dismissed or referred for mental health evaluation, which they interpret as the system colluding with their harassers. The online TI community actively discourages members from accepting mental health diagnoses or treatment, framing psychiatry as part of the targeting apparatus, which prevents those who might benefit from treatment from receiving it. The suffering is real, regardless of cause. TIs describe lives destroyed by their experiences, lost jobs because they couldn't function, or because they accused coworkers of being harassers, destroyed relationships because family and friends don't believe them, or are themselves accused of participating in the targeting. Constant fear and hypervigilance that prevents rest or normalcy. In some cases, suicide because the harassment becomes unbearable. Whether the harassment is external or the suffering stems from untreated mental illness, producing these terrible experiences, the pain is genuine and the impact on quality of life is devastating. There are also documented edge cases that complicate clean categorization. Instances where surveillance that seemed paranoid was later proven real. Corporate espionage victims who were dismissed as paranoid before evidence emerged of actual monitoring. Abuse victims whose claims of organized harassment by their ex-partner's network were validated by evidence. These cases demonstrate that what appears to be paranoid delusion can sometimes be accurate assessment of actual threat, creating an ethical imperative not to reflexively dismiss all claims as illness. The question of motive, why would anyone target ordinary individuals with such elaborate harassment, is where many skeptical assessments focus. TIs often can't identify why they're valuable targets, why resources would be expended to harass them. Some propose they're being used as test subjects for perfecting psychological warfare techniques, that they're random selections meant to develop and refine methods that will later be used more broadly. Others suggest blacklists or algorithmic selection, where people get flagged for characteristics that trigger targeting, even if they don't understand what made them targets. Without clear motive, the harassment seems purposeless, which supports the mental health interpretation. But intelligence and military operations don't always have obvious motives from outside perspectives, and test programs by their nature wouldn't target people for strategic reasons, but for experimental reasons. The ethical approach involves taking claims seriously enough to investigate when possible, providing resources for protection if evidence of actual harassment exists, while also ensuring access to mental health support without forcing it on people against their will, or using psychiatric diagnosis as a weapon to discredit legitimate complaints. This balance is difficult to achieve in practice. Law enforcement typically finds no evidence to support TI claims and doesn't have resources to provide indefinite protection based on unprovable allegations. Mental health services can't force treatment on people who refuse it unless they meet criteria for involuntary commitment. Support organizations often aren't equipped to handle the complexity of cases where harassment might be real, might be delusional, or might be some combination that doesn't fit clean categories. The TI phenomenon also serves as a lens for examining surveillance society and the psychological effects of living under actual widespread monitoring. We know our digital communications are surveilled by corporations and governments. that algorithms track and predict our behavior, that cameras and sensors record our movements through public spaces. This real surveillance could create conditions where people who are more sensitive to these intrusions or who have psychological vulnerabilities interpret the ambient surveillance as targeted personal harassment, mistaking the general panopticon for specific persecution. Or the real surveillance infrastructure might occasionally be weaponized against individuals in ways that produce TI experiences, with most dismissals of their claims serving to hide the minority of cases where targeting is actually occurring. What remains clear is that thousands of people globally identify as targeted individuals, share remarkably consistent descriptions of harassment and surveillance, suffer real distress from their experiences, and struggle to find help or validation in systems that either dismiss them as delusional or lack resources to investigate their claims. Whether they're victims of sophisticated psychological operations that most people never become aware of, whether they're experiencing symptoms of mental illness that present in culturally specific ways shaped by surveillance society and shared online narratives, or whether the truth involves some complex interaction between real harassment and psychological vulnerability. Where both exist but are difficult to disentangle, the phenomenon represents significant suffering and raises important questions about surveillance, mental health, and how we respond when people report experiences that seem implausible, but that can't be definitively disproven, and that cause obvious harm to those experiencing them. The targeted individual community continues to grow online, continues to share stories and strategies, continues to document their harassment, and support each other through experiences that isolate them from friends and family who don't believe them. They deserve compassion regardless of whether their experiences stem from external harassment or internal illness, and they deserve serious engagement with their claims rather than reflexive dismissal, even when those claims seem to exceed credible possibility. Because the cost of being wrong, of dismissing genuine victims as delusional, or of enabling mental illness by validating delusions, is high in both directions, leaving us with a phenomenon that resists easy resolution, that challenges our frameworks for understanding both surveillance capabilities and mental health, and that will likely persist as technology advances and as online communities continue to provide spaces where people experiencing these symptoms can find others who share their reality, validating experiences that the broader society refuses to acknowledge or believe. Children's drawings of previous lives they never lived. There are cases documented across cultures and continents where young children, typically between ages 2 and 6, begin spontaneously describing lives they claim to have lived before, providing names, locations, and specific details about people and events they shouldn't have any knowledge of. Memories that emerge without prompting from parents who often find the claims disturbing rather than encouraging. But some of these children don't just talk about their alleged previous lives. They draw them, creating pictures that depict places they've never been, people they've never met, events they never witnessed in their current existence, producing artwork with details that can sometimes be verified through historical research, or by locating the people and places the child describes. Details that seem impossible for a young child to know through normal means. A 4-year-old draws a specific house in a distant town they've never visited, including architectural features and landscape elements that match the actual location when investigators check. A 5-year-old sketches a person they claim was their spouse in a previous life, and the drawing resembles photographs of a real person who died years before the child was born, someone the child's family has no connection to and had never heard of. A 3-year-old depicts a traumatic death, a plane crash, a drowning, a violent incident, with details that correspond to actual historical events, accidents that occurred decades earlier in locations the child has no exposure to. rendering scenes they should have no way of visualizing with an accuracy that disturbs parents and fascinates researchers who investigate claims of reincarnation. These aren't vague, impressionistic sketches that could represent anything, but specific detailed drawings that contain verifiable information, that depict real places and real people and real events from the past, created by children too young to have learned this information through conventional means, too young in many cases to have been taught much about history or geography. Producing artwork that suggests they're accessing memories of experiences they never had in their current lives. Memories that, if genuine, would prove that consciousness survives death and can transfer between bodies. That reincarnation isn't religious mythology, but documentable reality. Or alternatively, that children are somehow accessing information through means we don't understand, collective unconscious, telepathy, genetic memory, or some other mechanism that allows knowledge to transfer across time and space in ways that conventional neuroscience doesn't acknowledge, leaving researchers and families confronting drawings that shouldn't exist, that contain information children shouldn't possess, that either prove reincarnation or prove that human consciousness and memory work in ways far stranger than materialism allows. Ways that permit young children to know things about the past that they have no normal means of knowing, to visualize scenes they never witnessed, to draw people they never met, to depict lives they never lived, but that they claim with absolute certainty were theirs before they were born, into their current bodies, before their current memories began, when they were someone else living somewhere else, in circumstances that ended and that somehow left traces in consciousness that survived death and reanimated in new bodies, in children who remember and who draw what they remember, creating visual documentation of the impossible, of memories that transcend individual lifespans, of consciousness that persists beyond death, or of something equally strange that allows children to access historical information through mechanisms neuroscience hasn't discovered, leaving their drawings as evidence that demands explanation, but that resists easy categorization as either proof of reincarnation or proof of elaborate coincidence and false memory. The research into children's past life claims has been most extensively documented by psychiatrist Ian Stevenson and his successor, Jim Tucker, at the University of Virginia's Division of Perceptual Studies. Over decades, they've investigated thousands of cases where children report memories of previous lives, focusing on cases where the children provide specific verifiable details that can be checked against historical records or by locating the families of the deceased persons the children claim to have been. The strongest cases involve children who name their previous identity, describe their death, identify family members from their claimed previous life by name or relationship, and provide details about locations, possessions, or events that are later confirmed as accurate when investigators locate the previous family and verify the information against their knowledge and records. The drawings add a dimension beyond verbal testimony. A child might describe a previous life in ways that parents could unconsciously influence through leading questions, or that could be confabulated from fragments of overheard information. But drawings capture visual detail that's harder to explain through suggestion. When a child draws a specific building's architecture, including details like window placement, door configuration, unique structural features, and surrounding landscape elements, and that drawing matches a real location the child has never visited or seen photographs of, the explanation through normal means becomes strained. When a child draws a person's face with distinctive features, and that drawing resembles photographs of the deceased person they claim to have been, the coincidence starts to seem less plausible. One documented case from Thailand involved a child who drew detailed pictures of a previous life as a teacher in a specific school in a town he'd never been to. The drawings included the school building's layout, the arrangement of desks in the classroom, and even specific decorative elements in the room. When researchers took the child to the town he'd described, the school existed with architecture and interior details matching his drawings, despite the child never having visited or seen pictures of the location. The family of the deceased teacher confirmed that the child's descriptions and drawings accurately depicted the teacher's life, workplace, and death, providing details that the child's family had no way of knowing and that weren't in public records or accessible through normal research methods. Another case from India involved a girl who from age 3 described being a woman who had died in a neighboring village, providing the woman's name, family details, and descriptions of her house and possessions. The child drew pictures of the house, including specific decorative items, the arrangement of rooms, and a distinctive tree in the courtyard. When the two families eventually connected, the drawings matched the deceased woman's actual home, including details like the position of certain religious pictures on walls and the specific type of tree the girl had drawn. The deceased woman's family confirmed that these details were accurate but weren't widely known outside the immediate household, making it difficult to explain how the child could have learned them through normal information channels. The American cases documented by Tucker often involve children who draw scenes from past lives with details that are later verified. A boy in Oklahoma began at age 4, talking about being a Hollywood extra in the 1930s and 40s, providing specific details about movies and actors and life in Hollywood during that era. His drawings included specific buildings, cars, and street scenes from that period, rendered with accuracy that seemed impossible for a child in the 1990s to possess without exposure to detailed historical resources about Hollywood's golden age. When researchers investigated, they were able to identify the person the child claimed to have been, a Hollywood extra who had died in the 1970s, and verified many of the child's claims and drawings against historical records and surviving photographs from that era. The spontaneity of these memories and drawings is significant. The children aren't prompted or encouraged to remember previous lives. The memories emerge spontaneously, often to parents' confusion or distress, particularly in Western cultures where reincarnation isn't part of the dominant belief system. Parents often initially dismiss the claims, try to discourage the child from talking about it, or become worried that their child is disturbed or fantasizing. The fact that memories persist despite parental discouragement suggests they're not being reinforced or encouraged by the family environment. The memories typically fade as children get older. By age 7 or 8, most children who reported previous life memories stop talking about them, and when interviewed later, often have little to no recollection of having made the claims. This developmental pattern is consistent across cultures and cases, suggesting a window in early childhood where whatever mechanism allows access to these memories is active, closing as the child's current life personality and memories become more dominant, and as the neural structures supporting current identity solidify. The trauma correlation is notable. Many children who report previous life memories describe deaths that were violent or traumatic. Accidents, murders, warfare, sudden illness. The percentage of cases involving traumatic death is far higher than the percentage of deaths that are traumatic in the general population, suggesting that violent or sudden death might somehow make memories more likely to persist or transfer. This could indicate that unresolved trauma at death creates stronger memory traces, or could indicate that the mechanism by which memories transfer is somehow activated or facilitated by trauma. Birthmarks and birth defects that correspond to fatal wounds from claimed previous lives appear in some cases. Children with birthmarks matching the location of fatal gunshot wounds described in their previous life memories. Scars that correspond to surgical incisions from the previous person's medical history, or physical anomalies that match injuries or conditions the previous person had. Stevenson documented hundreds of these cases, photographing the birthmarks and comparing them to medical records or autopsy reports from the deceased persons, finding matches that seem too specific to be coincidental. The cultural variation is significant. Cases are reported most frequently in cultures where reincarnation is an accepted belief: Buddhism, Hinduism, various indigenous traditions. But they occur in Western contexts as well, just less frequently or less openly due to cultural resistance to the concept. Whether this reflects actual difference in reincarnation rates or merely difference in reporting and acknowledgement is unclear. Parents in cultures that believe in reincarnation might notice and document behaviors that Western parents dismiss or discourage. The skeptical explanations focus on false memory, suggestion, coincidence, and fraud. Children are highly suggestible and imaginative, capable of confabulating elaborate false memories from fragmentary inputs. Parents who believe in reincarnation might unconsciously cue children, might ask leading questions, might selectively remember and report the hits while forgetting the misses. The verification process might be contaminated by confirmation bias, with investigators finding patterns and matches that seem significant because they're looking for them, and some cases might involve deliberate fraud, families fabricating claims for attention or religious validation. But the best documented cases resist easy dismissal. When children provide specific names, addresses, and details that can be independently verified before the families have contact, when they draw locations they've never seen with accuracy that seems beyond coincidence. When birthmarks match fatal wounds documented in medical records, the conventional explanations strain. Either these cases represent evidence of some mechanism by which consciousness or information transfers across lives, or they represent remarkable strings of coincidence and contamination that somehow produce specificity that seems impossible through chance. The mechanism, if reincarnation is real, remains unknown. How does consciousness survive death? How does it select or find a new body? What determines when and where reincarnation occurs? Why do only some people report previous life memories? What exactly transfers? Is it soul, consciousness, information, quantum states? The Buddhist and Hindu frameworks that have explored reincarnation for millennia provide religious and philosophical answers, but not mechanisms that scientific materialism can accept or test. Alternative explanations that don't require reincarnation include genetic memory, information somehow encoded in DNA from ancestors, though this can't explain cases where children remember lives as people unrelated to their family. Collective unconscious a la Jung, accessing archetypal information or memories stored in some universal field, though this doesn't explain the specific individual details children provide. Telepathy or super ESP, somehow psychically accessing information about deceased persons from still living people who knew them or from records, though this requires accepting psychic abilities that are themselves unproven. Cryptomnesia, memories of information encountered and forgotten, though this struggles to explain cases where children provide information that doesn't exist in accessible form for them to have encountered. The implications if genuine reincarnation is occurring are profound for understanding consciousness, death, identity, and the nature of self. If consciousness survives death and reanimates in new bodies, then materialism is false. Consciousness isn't merely emergent property of brain function. Death isn't the end of experience, and personal identity is more fluid and complex than we typically conceive. The person you are might be a continuation of someone who died before you were born, carrying forward memories and possibly personality traits and phobias and inclinations from previous existence. The drawings provide a specific form of evidence that's both compelling and puzzling. They're spontaneous productions by young children, visual representations of claimed memories, containing details that can be verified or falsified. They're harder to dismiss than verbal testimony because they capture information that seems impossible for children to fabricate without access to visual references they shouldn't have. A child who's never seen photographs of 1940s. Hollywood shouldn't be able to draw accurate period details. A child who's never visited a distant town shouldn't be able to sketch specific buildings with accurate architectural features. Yet the drawings also aren't perfect. They're child drawings, rendered with the motor skills and artistic ability of young children, which means they're imprecise, stylized, sometimes ambiguous. This imprecision creates interpretive latitude. How much does a child's drawing have to match a real location to count as a hit? How much similarity is required before we call it evidence rather than coincidence? The subjective element in evaluating whether drawings match their claimed reference creates opportunity for bias to influence conclusions. The pattern across thousands of cases investigated over decades suggests something genuine is occurring, even if its nature remains disputed. Children across cultures spontaneously provide detailed information about deceased persons' lives, information that can be verified and that the children shouldn't have normal access to. The addition of drawings that visually depict these claimed memories adds a layer of documentation that strengthens the most compelling cases while also revealing the limitations and ambiguities that prevent definitive proof. Whether these children are genuinely remembering previous lives, whether they're accessing information through unknown psychic or consciousness mechanisms, whether the cases represent elaborate coincidence and false memory, or whether some combination of factors creates the appearance of past life memory. When something else is actually occurring, their drawings remain as artifacts that demand explanation. Visual representations of claimed memories that children too young to have agendas create spontaneously. Drawings that sometimes contain verifiable details that seem impossible for the children to know, that depict places and people and events from before they were born, that if genuine would prove consciousness survives death, and that human identity isn't bound to a single lifetime, but continues across multiple existences, reincarnating with memories that sometimes persist in early childhood before fading as the new life's experiences overwrite the old, leaving only these drawings as documentation, only the artwork created by children who remember living before, who remember dying and being born again, who draw what they remember from lives they claim were theirs, lives that ended and that somehow left traces in consciousness that transferred into new bodies, into children who for a few years remember and who draw and who tell anyone who'll listen that they lived before, that they were someone else, that they died and came back. And here are the drawings to prove it. Pictures that either document the impossible or document the most elaborate false memories children have ever spontaneously generated. Drawings that researchers study and skeptics dismiss and parents keep in uncertain wonder, never quite sure whether their child is accessing genuine memories from a previous life or whether something else is creating the impression of memory when no actual previous life existed, leaving the drawings in permanent ambiguity, evidence that could prove reincarnation or could prove nothing, depending on how you interpret them, depending on what you believe about consciousness and death, and whether identity can persist across the boundary that separates one life from the next, whether children can remember lives they never lived in their current bodies, whether their drawings depict real previous experiences or impossible false memories, whether consciousness survives death, or whether these cases represent something equally strange that we don't yet understand, leaving the drawings as they are, created by children, depicting claimed previous lives, containing sometimes verifiable details, challenging materialism, supporting reincarnation beliefs, resisting definitive proof, remaining forever in that uncertain space where the most interesting evidence lives, where proof and disproof both seem possible, but neither seems achievable, where children's artwork becomes testimony about the nature of consciousness and death, and whether we live once or many times, whether death ends us or merely transitions us to new beginning, whether these children truly remember previous lives, or whether they're accessing something we can't explain, drawing pictures we can't dismiss, creating evidence we can't ignore but can't definitively interpret, leaving us with drawings of previous lives they never lived, or that they did live before being born again, before becoming who they are now, before forgetting as they always do by age 7 or 8, leaving only the drawings from when they still remembered, when they could still access whatever memories or information or consciousness fragments persist across death and rebirth, captured in child-rendered pictures that are either the most compelling evidence for reincarnation or the most puzzling false memories children spontaneously generate, drawings that remain, that document something, that prove either everything or nothing, depending on what framework you use to interpret them, leaving children's drawings of previous lives they never lived, or that they did live as permanent testimony to mysteries we can't solve, questions we can't answer, evidence we possess but can't conclusively evaluate, drawings that exist as artifacts of childhood, of claimed past lives, of consciousness that might survive death, of memories that might transfer across lifetimes, of children who remember and draw what they remember before forgetting, before becoming fully themselves in this life, before the previous life fades completely, leaving only drawings, only memories in picture form, only evidence that tantalizes and frustrates, that suggests reincarnation might be real, that consciousness might survive death, that children might genuinely remember previous existences, or that something equally mysterious creates these effects through mechanisms we haven't discovered, leaving the drawings as they are and have always been unexplained, fascinating, disturbing, compelling, ambiguous, evidence of something but evidence that refuses to definitively tell us what that something is. Polybius, the arcade game that drove players insane. In 1981, according to urban legend that emerged decades later, a mysterious arcade game called Polybius appeared in a handful of suburban Portland, Oregon locations, installed without fanfare or advertising, drawing players through word of mouth about its intensely addictive and disorienting gameplay. The game allegedly featured abstract vector graphics, psychedelic color patterns, and gameplay mechanics that were simultaneously compelling and disturbing, drawing players into extended sessions that left them experiencing severe psychological and physiological effects. Within weeks of playing Polybius, people reportedly suffered amnesia, night terrors, seizures, hallucinations, and profound aversion to video games in general, symptoms so severe that several players allegedly required hospitalization for psychiatric evaluation. The machines were supposedly monitored by men in black who would visit the arcade locations after hours, opening the cabinets not to collect quarters, but to retrieve data, as if the game itself was collecting information beyond high scores, as if player interactions were being studied for purposes the arcade owners didn't understand and weren't authorized to know. Then, after approximately 1 month of operation, the Polybius machines vanished as mysteriously as they'd appeared, removed from all locations simultaneously, with the company allegedly responsible. Sinneslotion, a name that means sense deletion. In German, having no traceable existence, no business records, no other products, no employees who could be identified or interviewed. The game became legendary in retro gaming communities as the ultimate lost arcade cabinet, the subject of desperate searches by collectors and historians, who found no physical evidence that Polybius ever existed. No ROM dumps, no circuit boards, no cabinets, no advertisements, no contemporary documentation from 1981 mentioning the game. Yet the legend persists with remarkable consistency across sources, creating the question of whether Polybius was a real psychological experiment disguised as entertainment, a government or military program, testing subliminal messaging or consciousness manipulation through gaming platforms, or whether it's entirely fictional, an internet-age urban legend that has achieved such cultural penetration that people now remember or claim to have played a game that never existed, their memories constructed from the legend itself, rather than from actual experience, creating false recollection through the power of shared narrative, leaving Polybius as either the most successfully suppressed arcade game in history or the most successful fictional creation masquerading as suppressed history. A game that supposedly drove players insane, and that might itself be driving researchers and enthusiasts insane in their attempts to determine whether it was ever real. The timeline is crucial to understanding Polybius skepticism. The game allegedly appeared in 1981, but the first documented mention of it doesn't appear until 1998, when it was added to coinop.org, a website cataloging arcade games, listed as if it were a real title alongside genuinely documented games. The listing provided brief information about its existence and effects, but cited no sources, included no screenshots or technical specifications, and was added by an unknown contributor. From this single database entry, the legend spread through gaming forums, paranormal websites, and eventually mainstream internet culture, each retelling adding details and elaborations until Polybius became one of the most famous lost arcade games, despite having no contemporary evidence of existence. The 17-year gap between alleged release and first documentation is the central problem. 1981 had active arcade gaming culture, enthusiast magazines, local news coverage of arcade trends and controversies. If a game had caused the dramatic effects attributed to Polybius, multiple hospitalizations, seizures, government agents monitoring machines, it would have generated contemporary news coverage, health warnings, investigations by consumer protection agencies. Arcade owners who installed machines causing such problems would have removed them and reported to distributors. Players who suffered would have sought legal recourse. Parents would have complained to authorities. Yet no contemporary newspaper articles, no health department records, no consumer complaints from 1981 mention anything resembling Polybius, suggesting either the story is entirely fabricated or the suppression was so complete and so effective that every piece of contemporary evidence was eliminated, which seems implausible given the number of independent parties who would have been involved. The name Polybius itself is interesting. It references the ancient Greek historian Polybius, who wrote extensively about Rome and who developed techniques for encoding secret messages. Naming a supposedly experimental mind control game after a historian associated with cryptography and hidden information might be intentional, meaningful choice by whoever created the game, or might be someone later creating the legend choosing a name that would add layers of significance and conspiratorial implication, making the game seem more sophisticated and intentional than random arcade cabinet number 7 would suggest. The company name Sinneslotion, sense deletion, is almost too perfect, too on the nose for a supposed psychological experiment. Real covert programs use innocuous cover names, generic corporate titles that don't advertise their actual purposes. A company literally named Sense Deletion, creating a mind-altering arcade game, is either remarkably blatant or is someone crafting a legend and choosing a dramatically appropriate but implausibly obvious name, favoring narrative coherence over plausible operational security. The Men in Black collecting data is a borrowed trope from UFO lore and conspiracy culture, generally. Mysterious government agents who appear to suppress information and monitor civilian encounters with classified projects. Their appearance in the Polybius legend connects the game to broader conspiracy narratives, suggests government involvement without requiring specification of which agency or what program, creates atmosphere of surveillance and control that's thematically appropriate, but that's also a recycled element from other legends, rather than a detail that emerged organically from witness accounts. The symptoms attributed to Polybius, amnesia, night terrors, aversion to gaming, are consistent with severe psychological trauma or with certain neurological conditions. But they're also symptoms that would make victims unreliable witnesses. If you develop amnesia and aversion to the thing that caused your symptoms, you can't provide clear testimony about what the game was like, what happened during play, what specific elements triggered your reaction. This creates a built-in explanation for why detailed descriptions of gameplay don't exist from alleged victims. They can't remember or can't bring themselves to engage with gaming topics, conveniently making the central evidence inaccessible. The actual arcade gaming landscape of 1981 does include some relevant context. This was the peak of arcade gaming's golden age. With new games appearing constantly, with intense competition for player attention and quarters. Experimental games with unusual mechanics or presentation did exist, and some games did produce seizures in photosensitive individuals, leading to warnings and modifications. The possibility that an experimental game with particularly intense visuals or novel gameplay mechanics could have caused adverse reactions in a subset of players isn't implausible. What's implausible is that such a game would then be completely memory holed, with no remaining physical evidence, no contemporary documentation, no circuit boards or ROM chips surviving in the hands of collectors or in storage facilities. The Portland location is significant because Portland has reputation for oddness, for being placed where strange things happen or are more readily accepted. Setting the legend in Portland, rather than more conventional locations, adds plausibility through association with a city known for its counterculture and unusual characteristics. But Portland's arcade scene in the 80s had active participants who are still alive and accessible, and when investigators have attempted to find anyone who actually remembers Polybius appearing in Portland arcades in 1981, they've come up empty. Arcade operators, collectors, enthusiasts who were active in that scene at that time don't remember the game, don't remember hearing about mysterious health effects, don't have the collective memory that would exist if something as dramatic as Polybius actually occurred. The psychological experiment theory proposes that Polybius was a military or intelligence project, testing whether interactive entertainment could be used for behavior modification, consciousness alteration, or information gathering. The game would be a disguised testing apparatus placed in public locations where targets would voluntarily engage with it, providing data about how humans respond to specific visual patterns, gameplay mechanics, or subliminal messaging embedded in the game code. This makes Polybius part of the MK Ultra lineage, similar to documented programs where drugs and psychological techniques were tested on unwitting subjects, just using arcade gaming as the delivery mechanism. The technology to create such effects would depend on what specific outcomes were intended. If the goal was inducing seizures or disorientation, rapid flashing patterns and specific color combinations can affect neurological function, particularly in photosensitive individuals. If the goal was subliminal messaging, frames could be inserted below conscious perception threshold, containing images or text that might influence behavior or belief. If the goal was addiction or compulsion, gameplay mechanics could be designed using operant conditioning principles, variable reward schedules, and difficulty curves that create obsessive play patterns. All of this is theoretically possible with 1981 technology, though whether it could be done effectively and covertly remains questionable. The complete absence of physical evidence is what ultimately makes Polybius most likely fictional. Arcade cabinets are large, durable objects. Circuit boards and ROM chips are physical components that don't simply vanish. Even if machines were recalled and destroyed, components circulate through secondary markets, sit in storage, end up in private collections. The arcade collecting community is extensive and dedicated, with people who specialize in tracking down and preserving rare and obscure games. If Polybius machines existed in commercial deployment, even briefly, physical components should exist somewhere in collections, in storage facilities, in landfills, discoverable through forensic investigation, if not through active collecting. The ROM code particularly should exist. Video game code is copied, archived, shared through enthusiast networks. Even extremely rare and obscure arcade games from the 80s have had their ROMs dumped and preserved. The absence of Polybius ROM, despite intensive searching by emulation and preservation communities, strongly suggests there was never ROM to find, never game code that existed, because the game itself never existed except as story. But the legend serves psychological and cultural functions regardless of whether the game was real. It expresses anxieties about technology's effects on consciousness, about corporations or governments using entertainment as tool for manipulation or control, about the addictive properties of gaming and whether they're natural byproducts of engaging design or deliberate exploitation of psychological vulnerabilities. Polybius as legend allows discussion of these concerns through the narrative of a game that took these possibilities to extreme, that was purely exploitative, that damaged players deliberately for experimental purposes, making explicit the implicit fears about what entertainment technology might be doing to users. The internet age has transformed how legends like Polybius spread and persist. Pre-internet, urban legends were limited by geographical transmission, by the telephone game distortion that occurs through oral retelling. Internet allows legends to be documented in text, to spread globally instantly, to accumulate elaborations that get added to the canonical version, to be researched and debunked, and yet continue circulating because debunking reaches different audiences than the original legend. Polybius exemplifies this dynamic. It's been thoroughly debunked, with researchers demonstrating the absence of contemporary evidence. Yet it persists in gaming culture, gets referenced in TV shows and video games, maintains presence as the game that drove players crazy, despite the overwhelming likelihood that it never existed. Some researchers have proposed that Polybius might be based on confused memories of real games. Tempest, released in 1981, had vector graphics and intense visual effects that could induce discomfort. Various arcade games from that era did cause seizures in photosensitive players before warnings became standard. Perhaps memories of these real incidents became conflated and elaborated into the Polybius legend, creating a fictional game from fragmentary real experiences with multiple different games and incidents. The false memory angle is particularly interesting. If enough people hear detailed descriptions of Polybius, some percentage may develop false memories of having encountered or played it, their brains constructing memory-like experiences from the legend rather than from actual events. Studies of false memory demonstrate that people can be induced to remember events that didn't happen if they're given enough detail and social confirmation, if the suggested event is plausible within their life context, if they're repeatedly exposed to the narrative. Polybius provides all these elements for people who were arcade gamers in the early 80s, potentially creating a population of people who genuinely believe they remember a game that never existed. Whether Polybius was real psychological experiment, real game with effects that were exaggerated into legend, or pure fiction that has achieved legendary status through internet propagation. The game, or its legend, has become part of gaming culture, a story that gamers know and reference, that represents anxieties about technology and consciousness, that serves as cautionary tale about entertainment that's too engaging or too manipulative, that warns about hidden agendas in commercial products, that suggests reality might contain suppressed histories and removed artifacts that left no trace except stories that persist despite lack of evidence. The search for Polybius continues among some enthusiasts, convinced that somewhere physical evidence exists, that ROM dumps or circuit boards or cabinet components sit in storage waiting to be discovered and prove the legend true. Others have created modern versions, hoax Polybius cabinets, or ROM hacks that attempt to recreate what the legendary game might have been like, blurring the line further between historical artifact and contemporary fiction, making Polybius real in the present, even if it was never real in the past. And perhaps that's the ultimate truth of Polybius, that it's more powerful as legend than it could have been as actual game, that the story of a mind-altering arcade cabinet serves cultural and psychological purposes that don't require the game to have been real, that Polybius exists perfectly in the space of maybe happened and probably didn't, of suppressed truth and creative fiction, of conspiracy theory and urban legend, occupying the same uncertain territory as so many other stories that can't be proven, but can't be entirely dismissed, that persist because they express something true about fears and possibilities, even if the specific events described never occurred, leaving Polybius as the game that drove players insane, or the legend that drives researchers insane trying to verify it. The arcade cabinet that appeared and disappeared in 1981, taking players' sanity with it, or the story that appeared in 1998 and has been taking researchers' time and credibility ever since, as they search for evidence of something that all available data suggests never existed outside imagination and internet. A game that was never programmed and never installed and never played, except in the collective consciousness where legends live, where Polybius will remain. As long as people wonder whether somewhere, somehow, maybe it actually was real. Maybe the men in black did collect the machines. Maybe the evidence was successfully suppressed. Maybe Sinneslauschen was real, and the sense deletion they accomplished included deleting all trace of their own existence and their experimental game, leaving only the legend, only the story, only the persistent urban myth of Polybius, the arcade game that drove players insane, the game that might never have existed, but that exists now as legend, as cautionary tale, as mystery that may never be solved because there's nothing to solve, no truth to uncover. Except that humans create powerful stories about things that frighten or fascinate us, and Polybius, real or fictional, has become one of those stories, permanent fixture in gaming folklore, permanent mystery in conspiracy theory catalogs, permanent question that will likely never receive definitive answer, because the evidence we'd need to prove or disprove it vanished in 1981, or never existed at all, leaving us only with the legend of the game that was too effective, that worked too well, that accessed consciousness in ways that entertainment shouldn't, that drove players insane and then disappeared as completely as if it had never existed, taking with it any certainty about whether any of this actually happened, or whether Polybius is entirely fiction that has successfully masqueraded, though, as suppressed history, leaving us to wonder forever about the arcade cabinet that might have stood in Portland suburbs for 1 month in 1981, might have damaged players' minds, might have been government experiment or corporate accident, or might simply be the most successful gaming urban legend ever created, a story so compelling and so detailed that decades later, people still search for evidence, still believe it might be real, still feel the pull of a mystery that cannot be solved, because there's nothing to find, no game to discover, no truth to reveal, except that sometimes the most powerful games are the ones that exist only in imagination, only in legend, only in the persistent story of Polybius, the game that drove players insane, or the game that never existed at all. Dulce Base, underground human-alien genetic experiments. Beneath the desert rock of northern New Mexico, near the small town of Dulce on the Jicarilla Apache Reservation, something allegedly exists that the government will never acknowledge. Not a storage facility, not a communications hub, not a simple underground military installation, like hundreds of others scattered across the American Southwest. According to those who claim to have worked there, to have been held there, or to have stumbled upon evidence of its existence, Dulce Base is a joint human-alien facility descending 7 levels deep into the earth, where genetic experiments are conducted that violate every understanding of ethics, biology, and human rights. The deeper you go, the darker the work becomes, until at the lowest levels, you find things that can't be called human anymore. Things that were human once, things created from scratch that were never human at all. If even a fraction of what whistleblowers describe is true, then everything we've been told about alien contact, government cooperation, and the sanctity of human autonomy is a comfortable lie masking a nightmare operating just beneath our feet. The story of Dulce Base emerged primarily through the testimony of Phil Schneider and Thomas Costello, 2 men who claimed direct involvement with the facility and who both met mysterious ends after going public with their allegations. Schneider described himself as a geological engineer, working on underground base construction for the government and military contractors. In the late 1970s, he was allegedly part of a drilling operation near Dulce when they broke through into an existing cavern system. What they found inside wasn't natural. The caverns had been modified, expanded, and occupied by beings that weren't human. A firefight erupted, Schneider was injured, and in the chaos he claimed to have seen technology and entities that convinced him humanity had made agreements with extraterrestrial species. Agreements that traded access to human subjects for technological knowledge. Thomas Costello claimed to be a security officer at Dulce Base, working in the facility for years before his conscience or his fear drove him to leave and attempt to expose what was happening. He described a massive multi-level complex built into the mesa, with the upper levels occupied by human personnel and conventional operations. Offices, security stations, storage areas that could plausibly be explained if discovered. But the lower levels, accessed through security checkpoints that grew progressively more restrictive, contained laboratories where the line between human and alien blurred until it dissolved entirely. Costello spoke of seeing humans in cages, of witnessing procedures where genetics were being manipulated, where consciousness was being altered or transferred, where things that had started as human were being transformed into something else entirely. The facility is described as a joint operation with human scientists and military personnel working alongside gray aliens. The archetypal beings with large heads, enormous black eyes, and thin bodies that appear in countless abduction reports. But according to Dulce witnesses, these grays aren't simply visiting. They're resident, permanent, occupying sections of the base as if it's their facility as much as ours. The cooperation between human and alien personnel is described as hierarchical but complex, with some areas off limits to humans, others restricted to specific clearance levels, and tension between the two species barely contained beneath operational protocols. This isn't peaceful scientific collaboration. It's an arrangement born from power imbalance, from humanity's desperation for advanced technology and the aliens' need for something we possess: biological material, genetic diversity, or access to human consciousness for purposes we can't fully understand. Level 6 and 7 are where the horror intensifies according to testimony. Costello described rows of cages containing humans in various states of alteration. Some appeared drugged, barely conscious. Bodies showing signs of surgical intervention or genetic modification. Others were hybrids, beings that combined human and alien features in ways that suggested they'd been created rather than born, grown in artificial wombs or vats for purposes that remained obscure. He spoke of a section he called Nightmare Hall, where the most extreme experiments were conducted, where things existed that couldn't be categorized as human or alien, but represented some twisted fusion of both. The suffering in these areas was immense, though many subjects appeared too altered to fully comprehend their condition, their minds broken or modified along with their bodies. The genetic work allegedly pursued at Dulce involves attempts to create hybrid species that combine human adaptability and consciousness with alien physiology and abilities. The Greys, some theories suggest, are themselves a dying species, genetically stagnant, unable to reproduce successfully without outside intervention. Their interest in human genetics stems from desperate need. We possess something they've lost, some vitality or diversity that could revive their species or create a hybrid successor. The experiments explore which human traits are compatible with alien genetics, how consciousness translates between species, whether the essential qualities that make us human can survive being housed in non-human biology. Each hybrid represents data. Each failed experiment teaches them something, and the human cost is apparently acceptable to whatever authority authorized this arrangement. But hybridization flows both ways, according to some accounts. Human subjects are allegedly modified to be more alien, to survive in different atmospheric conditions, or to possess enhanced abilities. These experiments test the limits of how far human biology can be pushed before something fundamental breaks. Costello described subjects whose skeletal structure had been altered, whose organs had been modified or replaced with artificial or alien equivalents, whose nervous systems had been augmented with technology that blurred the line between living tissue and machine. The goal, he suggested, was creating humans who could survive extreme environments, who could interface directly with alien technology, or who could serve purposes that normal human biology wouldn't permit. The question of consent is central to the horror of Dulce. Where do these subjects come from? Abduction reports have been documented for decades, people claiming to be taken against their will, subjected to medical procedures aboard craft or in facilities they couldn't identify, then returned with missing time and fragmentary memories. Skeptics attribute these to sleep paralysis, false memories, or psychological conditions. But if Dulce exists, if underground facilities are conducting genetic experiments requiring human subjects, then abduction would be the mechanism for acquiring test subjects who won't be missed, or whose disappearance can be explained away. Missing person statistics show thousands of people vanishing every year without resolution. How many might have ended up in facilities like Dulce, their disappearance attributed to running away, foul play, or voluntary departure, when the truth is imprisonment in underground laboratories where their humanity is systematically stripped away. The technology described at Dulce goes beyond genetics. Costello spoke of vats where beings were grown rapidly from genetic templates, artificial wombs that could produce a fully developed hybrid in months, rather than the 9-month human gestation period. He described devices that could extract consciousness or transfer it between bodies, technology that treated the mind as software that could be copied, moved, or deleted. The implications are staggering. If consciousness can be extracted and stored, then death becomes optional for those with access to the technology. If it can be transferred, then bodies become disposable vehicles. If it can be copied, then the very concept of individual identity dissolves. What would you call a being that has your memories, your personality, your sense of self, but exists in a cloned body or an alien form? Is it you? Is it a copy? Does the distinction even matter? The alleged 1979 incident at Dulce represents a moment when cooperation collapsed into violence. According to Schneider and others, human personnel became increasingly disturbed by what they were witnessing in the lower levels. The treatment of human subjects, the nature of the experiments, the goals that seemed to serve alien interests far more than human benefit. Tension grew until it erupted into armed conflict. Humans and aliens exchanged fire in the underground tunnels. Casualties occurred on both sides. Schneider claimed to have been hit by an alien weapon that nearly killed him. Other sources suggest dozens died in the firefight before the situation was contained. Afterward, security was tightened. Human access to the lower levels became even more restricted, and anyone who knew too much about what sparked the conflict was reassigned or eliminated. The town of Dulce itself sits unaware above these alleged horrors. Population around 3,000, mostly Jicarilla Apache, living ordinary lives with no knowledge that beneath them might exist one of the most significant and disturbing secrets in human history. Except that some residents report strange things. Unexplained aircraft, particularly at night, lights moving in patterns that don't match conventional aviation, cattle mutilations that plague the region, animals found drained of blood with surgical precision, organs removed in ways that suggest advanced technology and purposes beyond simple predation or ritual. Sounds from beneath the ground, vibrations felt through the earth, phenomena that could be dismissed individually but collectively paint a picture of something unusual occurring in the area. The military presence near Dulce is documented and undeniable. Los Alamos National Laboratory, where nuclear weapons research continues, sits less than 100 miles away. Kirtland Air Force Base, associated with nuclear weapons and special projects, is nearby. The region has been home to classified research for decades, with vast stretches of federal land closed to public access. The infrastructure for underground facilities exists. We know the government has built installations below ground for continuity of operations, for storing sensitive materials, for conducting research that requires isolation. The question isn't whether underground bases exist in the Southwest. The question is what's being done in them, and whether any involve cooperation with non-human intelligence. Skeptics point to the lack of physical evidence, the absence of satellite imagery, showing the massive ventilation systems and power infrastructure that a 7-level underground facility would require, the fact that both primary witnesses are dead and their claims can't be verified. Phil Schneider died in 1996, found strangled with a catheter tube wrapped around his neck, officially ruled a suicide despite the manner of death and his repeated statements that he feared assassination. Thomas Costello disappeared in the late 80s after allegedly stealing photographs and video from Dulce Base, materials that were supposed to prove his claims but have never surfaced publicly. His wife and child disappeared with him. No bodies were found. No trace of their whereabouts has emerged. This could mean they're living under assumed identities in hiding, or it could mean they were eliminated along with the evidence they carried. The deeper implication of Dulce, if any version of it is real, extends beyond genetic experiments. It suggests a relationship between human government, presumably elements operating above conventional oversight, and alien species, a relationship based on trade, technology for access, advanced knowledge for biological material. The cooperation required to build and operate a joint facility implies communication, negotiation, agreements. When did this relationship begin? What authority decided humanity would enter into this arrangement? What were we promised in exchange for giving alien intelligence access to human subjects? And most disturbing, What happens if we try to back out of the agreement now? Do we even have that option, or have we become dependent on whatever technology we've received, locked into a relationship we can't escape without losing capabilities that have become essential? The genetic experiments also raise questions about other programs and phenomena. Are some UFO abductions actually human military operations designed to provide subjects for Dulce-like facilities while maintaining the alien cover story? Are the hybrids being created eventually released into the human population, walking among us indistinguishable from normal humans, but engineered for purposes we can't detect? Do the modifications and procedures pioneered on non-consenting subjects at Dulce eventually get refined and offered as enhancements to elite humans, creating a breakaway civilization that's genetically diverging from baseline humanity? Each question spawns more questions, a fractal of disturbing possibilities branching from the central premise that somewhere beneath the New Mexico desert, in laboratories carved into ancient rock, the boundaries of species and consciousness are being violated in the name of advancement or survival, or purposes we aren't meant to understand. Visitors to the Dulce area sometimes report strange compulsions, feelings of being watched, dreams or visions of underground facilities and gray figures, missing time they can't account for. These experiences could be suggestibility, the power of expecting to experience something unusual in a location associated with conspiracy theories. Or they could be residual effects of whatever actually occurs there, psychic contamination from the suffering and violation happening below. Or active scanning and influence from the facility's occupants, ensuring that no one who gets too close remembers enough to cause problems. The desert keeps secrets well, and the Earth provides perfect cover for operations that must never see daylight. Whether Dulce Base exists exactly as described, whether it's a distorted version of something that operates differently than witnesses understood, or whether it's entirely fabricated from fear and speculation, the concept resonates because it crystallizes anxieties we all carry about government secrecy, alien contact, and bodily autonomy. The fear that authorities have made deals we didn't consent to. The terror that advanced beings view us as resources rather than equals. The nightmare that human bodies and consciousness could be manipulated without permission or recourse. Dulce Base is where all these fears converge beneath the Earth, hidden from oversight, operating according to ethics that would horrify anyone who learned the details. And if Phil Schneider and Thomas Costello were telling the truth, if their deaths were the cost of trying to expose what they knew, then somewhere right now, beneath the desert, in levels descending deeper into darkness, work continues that we're better off never seeing. Experiments proceeding that answer questions we should never have asked, creating beings that should never exist. All in service of an arrangement between species that treats humanity not as partners, but as livestock, raw material for an agenda we'll never be permitted to fully understand. SCP Foundation, is it fiction or disclosure through entertainment? The SCP Foundation presents itself as collaborative creative writing, a massive online fiction project where thousands of contributors create documentation-style entries describing anomalous objects, entities, and phenomena that a shadowy organization called the Secure, Contain, Protect Foundation allegedly monitors and contains to prevent reality-altering threats from destroying or fundamentally changing the world. The writing style mimics redacted government documents, uses clinical language to describe impossible things, presents elaborate containment procedures for entities ranging from sentient sculptures to interdimensional horrors, and has created a universe of such depth and consistency that it functions as alternate reality documentation, as if the files are real and the fiction is simply the disclaimer that allows them to be published. The question that troubles some readers, and that conspiracy theorists have embraced, is whether this collaborative fiction might actually be something else. Whether the SCP Foundation exists in reality, and the fiction label is the mechanism by which actual anomalous phenomena can be disclosed publicly without causing panic or violation of classification. Whether the thousands of entries describing impossible objects and creatures are actually based on real files that have been slightly modified and released into the Creative Commons as entertainment, when they're actually soft disclosure, preparing humanity to accept that anomalies exist, that reality is far stranger than consensus understanding allows, and that somewhere, someone is actively working to contain and study the things that violate every rule we thought governed existence. The SCP format is distinctive: clinical containment procedures, object class designations indicating threat level, and containment difficulty. Descriptions that read like scientific documentation of the impossible, addenda containing incident reports, or research notes, or interview transcripts. The writing quality varies because thousands of authors contribute, but the best entries achieve remarkable verisimilitude, creating the sense that you're reading leaked classified documents, that the information you're accessing was never meant for public consumption, that you've stumbled into something real masquerading as fiction. This documentary style, this mimicry of government bureaucratic language applied to describing entities that shouldn't exist, creates cognitive dissonance that's both unsettling and compelling, making readers wonder if perhaps the line between fiction and reality is more permeable than they assumed. The theory that SCP represents disclosure through entertainment proposes several mechanisms. The most straightforward is that government agencies or private organizations that actually deal with anomalous phenomena use the SCP platform to release sanitized versions of real files, changing enough details to maintain plausible deniability while getting the core information into public awareness. This would serve multiple purposes. It desensitizes populations to concepts that would be shocking if revealed as fact. It creates a context where discussion of anomalies happens within a fiction framework that prevents panic, and it potentially crowdsources solutions or ideas by exposing the problems to thousands of creative minds who might suggest containment approaches or research avenues that actual researchers hadn't considered. The timing of SCP's emergence is noted by conspiracy theorists. The Wiki was founded in 2008, a period that saw increased discussion of government secrets following WikiLeaks releases, increased awareness of surveillance following Snowden revelations, and growing internet culture around collaborative world-building and alternate reality games. If disclosure was deemed necessary or inevitable, fictional frameworks that could absorb factual information while maintaining deniability would be valuable. SCP provides exactly such a framework. Anything can be added to the database, any anomaly can be described, and all of it is officially fiction, is clearly labeled as creative writing, is legally protected under that designation, even if some entries are actually describing real phenomena. The consistency of certain themes across SCP entries might suggest underlying truth rather than just convergent imagination. Entries frequently involve reality bending, dimensional anomalies, entities that violate physics, objects whose existence requires reconceptualizing fundamental assumptions about how reality works. If these themes appear repeatedly across thousands of independent authors, it could indicate either that humans share common anxieties and fascinations that manifest in similar fictional creations, or that authors are drawing on real information that's entered cultural consciousness through various disclosure vectors, creating fiction that unknowingly mirrors actual classified knowledge. The most famous SCP entries have achieved cultural penetration beyond the Wiki, inspiring video games, stories, artwork, and becoming recognizable even to people who don't actively follow the project. SCP-173, the statue that moves when not observed, is iconic. SCP-682, the indestructible reptile that adapts to any attempt to destroy it, has spawned endless discussions and derivative works. If these are based on real anomalous entities or objects, their popularization through fiction serves the dual purpose of disclosure and desensitization, making the actual existence of such things less shocking if they're ever officially acknowledged, because people have already encountered the concepts in entertainment contexts. The containment procedures described in SCP entries, while often elaborate to the point of absurdity, sometimes include elements that seem oddly specific or technically sophisticated, suggesting either authors with deep knowledge of actual security protocols or authors who are describing procedures that actually exist for containing real anomalies. The bureaucratic detail, the consideration of edge cases, the multiple levels of redundancy. These characteristics match how actual high-security facilities and hazardous materials handling work, suggesting that whoever writes the best SCP entries either has intimate knowledge of such systems or is adapting actual containment protocols for fictional anomalies. The psychological impact of certain SCP entries also suggests either extremely skilled horror writing or descriptions of genuinely disturbing phenomena that have been slightly fictionalized. Entries that produce lasting unease, that create sense of existential dread, or that touch on concepts that feel true even though they shouldn't, might be resonating because they're closer to reality than readers consciously recognize. The human mind can sense truth even when it's presented in fictional context, can respond to information at levels below conscious awareness, can know that something is real even when it's labeled as imaginary. The argument against SCP being disclosure relies heavily on the sheer volume and diversity of the content. There are thousands of entries describing incompatible anomalies, contradictory physics, entities that couldn't coexist in the same universe. If they're all disclosure of real phenomena, reality would have to be far more fractured and inconsistent than even the most open-minded person could accept. The rational conclusion is that the overwhelming majority is fiction, creative writing by talented amateurs and professionals, world building that has achieved remarkable coherence through collaborative effort and editorial standards that maintain quality and consistency. But this doesn't preclude the possibility that some entries, a small percentage, might be based on or directly copied from actual classified material. In an ocean of fiction, real disclosure could hide effectively, indistinguishable from the creative work surrounding it, protected by the overall fictional nature of the platform. An intelligence agency wanting to release information without violating classification could simply add it to SCP and let it blend with the thousands of other entries, knowing that even if someone recognized it as potentially real, they'd have no way to prove it and would be dismissed as overthinking fiction or falling prey to conspiracy thinking. The concept of memetic hazards in SCP lore, information that harms or alters those who perceive it, is particularly interesting from a disclosure perspective. If certain knowledge actually is dangerous, if some information genuinely affects consciousness or reality in ways that make it hazardous to know, then documenting such phenomena, even in fictional form, might serve as a warning or preparation, might help people understand that not all information is safe to access, that some truths are dangerous in ways beyond social or political consequences. Whether SCP's memetic hazards are purely fictional constructs, or whether they're describing real properties of certain information, remains impossible to determine. But the concept itself introduces ideas about information as substance, as having properties beyond meaning, that align with esoteric traditions and with some interpretations of quantum information theory. The SCP community's sophistication and self-awareness complicates the disclosure theory, Contributors know about the theory that SCP might be disclosure, have written metafictional entries exploring the idea that the fiction might be real, have incorporated this possibility into the narrative framework in ways that make it part of the fiction. This reflexive quality means that even the disclosure theory has been absorbed into the fictional universe, making it impossible to separate whether people are speculating about real disclosure or whether they're simply adding another layer to an elaborate collaborative fiction that includes speculation about its own reality as part of its entertainment value. The question of who would be doing the disclosing is also significant. SCP entries come from anonymous contributors, people using usernames without verification of identity. If agencies were using SCP for disclosure, they'd need people inside the community contributing entries, and those people would be indistinguishable from any other contributors. The democratic, collaborative nature of SCP means anyone can add content as long as it meets quality standards, which makes it perfect for covert disclosure, but also means that attributing any particular entry to actual classified sources is impossible without information beyond what's publicly available. The legal protection that fiction provides cannot be overstated. Classification laws apply to factual information. If something is presented as fiction, its publication generally doesn't violate classification, even if the fictional description happens to match classified reality. This creates a loophole that could theoretically be exploited for disclosure purposes. Someone with access to classified information about anomalies could write it up as an SCP entry, publish it as fiction, and be legally protected because they're not claiming it's real, not using it to inform policy or decisions, simply contributing to a collaborative creative project that's explicitly fictional. Whether SCP is disclosure or pure fiction might be a question that can never be definitively answered from outside classified channels. If it is disclosure, those with clearance would know but couldn't confirm it publicly without violating the very classifications the disclosure method is designed to work around. If it's pure fiction, there's no authoritative source that can prove a negative, that can confirm absolutely that no entry has ever been based on real classified phenomena. We're left in epistemological uncertainty, able to argue either position but unable to prove either conclusively. What's undeniable is that SCP has created a cultural framework where anomalies are discussed extensively, where people engage with concepts about reality that go far beyond consensus materialism, where the idea that the world contains impossible things monitored by shadow organizations has become familiar and almost comfortable through fictional exposure. Whether this familiarity is purely entertainment, whether it's accidental preparation for eventual official disclosure of anomalous phenomena, or whether it's deliberate desensitization to make actual disclosure less shocking, if it occurs, the effect is the same. Millions of people have engaged deeply with ideas about reality, being far stranger than we're officially told, about organizations existing beyond public oversight that manage threats we don't know exist, about the world containing things that violate physics and consciousness and sanity, all within a framework labeled fiction, but detailed enough to feel potentially real. The SCP Foundation exists as collaborative fiction, as entertainment, as creative world building that has achieved remarkable depth and cultural impact. Whether it also exists in reality, whether somewhere beyond public awareness, actual facilities contain actual anomalies described in documents that look remarkably like SCP entries, with slightly different details. Whether the Foundation's motto of secure, contain, protect is being operationalized by people who can never acknowledge what they do or what they found, remains speculation, remains theory, remains one of those questions where the fiction is either just fiction or the most successful cover story ever devised for phenomena that violate consensus reality so thoroughly that they could only be disclosed through mechanisms that maintain plausible deniability, that allow truth to hide in plain sight, labeled as imagination, that let people discuss and think about and prepare for a world far stranger than they officially believe exists, waiting perhaps for the day when the fiction label gets removed, when someone in authority stands up and says that some of these entries weren't creative writing, but were actual documentation. That SCP was never just a game or a story, but was soft disclosure all along, preparing minds and culture for revelations about what really exists in the shadows. What's really being contained in facilities you'll never visit. What's really secured against public knowledge behind classification barriers that entertainment can pierce when direct disclosure cannot. Making SCP either the most elaborate fiction ever crowd-created or the most successful truth hiding as fiction operation ever conducted. And we won't know which until someone with access decides to tell us, or until we stumble into an anomaly ourselves and realize too late that the containment procedures we read as fiction were actually instructions we should have taken seriously. That the warnings embedded in entertainment weren't just for the story, but were genuine attempts to prepare us for reality. That the Foundation is real and has been hiding in the open all along, secure behind the shield of being officially fictional, containing anomalies that officially don't exist, protecting a world that officially doesn't need protection from threats that officially aren't possible. All while we read the files and enjoy the horror and never quite believe that any of it could be true, which might be exactly the point, might be exactly how disclosure works when truth is too strange to be believed, too disruptive to be announced, too dangerous to be confirmed, leaving SCP hovering forever in that liminal space between fiction and reality, where the best secrets hide, where disclosure happens in plain sight, labeled as imagination, where we're told everything while being assured it's nothing, where the truth wears fiction as camouflage and waits patiently for the moment when everyone realizes that what they thought was entertainment was actually education, was actually preparation, was actually the Foundation itself, showing us exactly what it does and what it protects us from. Confident that the fiction label would prevent anyone from believing until belief became unavoidable, until the anomalies could no longer be contained, until reality itself broke down enough that official acknowledgement became necessary, and people raised on SCP would be less shocked than those who never engaged with the fiction that might, terrifyingly, have been fact all along. Liminal spaces. Why certain empty places feel wrong. There are places that feel wrong even though nothing overtly threatening is present. Empty hotel hallways lit by fluorescent lights that hum with electrical persistence. Abandoned shopping malls where the architecture of commerce persists without the people who were supposed to fill it. Parking garages in the dead hours between night and morning when your footsteps echo against concrete that stretches endlessly in every direction. Office buildings seen from outside at 3 a.m., where a few scattered lights reveal spaces that should be occupied but aren't. Stairwells that exist between floors serving purely transitional purposes. Airport terminals in that suspended time between flights when most shops are closed and the few travelers present seem like ghosts moving through a space designed for thousands. These are liminal spaces, places defined by transition and in-betweenness, locations that exist to be passed through rather than inhabited. And when you encounter them empty or outside their intended context, when you're present in them during hours or conditions when you're not supposed to be, something in human consciousness recognizes wrongness that can't be rationally explained, produces unease that seems disproportionate to actual threat, creates the sense that you've stepped outside normal reality into a version that's slightly off, that functions according to different rules, that might contain things or allow events that the populated daylight version of these spaces would prevent, leaving you feeling watched or exposed or displaced in ways that make you want to leave quickly. that make you understand viscerally that humans aren't meant to occupy these transitional spaces, that being present in them when they're empty transforms them into something other than what they're supposed to be, reveals them as stages without actors, as infrastructure without purpose, as the bones of civilization showing through skin that's supposed to hide them. And this revelation, this seeing places in states they're not meant to be seen, produces psychological responses that range from vague discomfort to profound existential dread, depending on individual sensitivity and the specific characteristics of the space being experienced. The aesthetic of liminal spaces has become recognized and cataloged through internet communities that share images of these transitional zones, creating collective awareness of something that was previously just individual experience, diffuse unease that people felt but didn't have language or framework for discussing. The images that resonate most strongly share characteristics. They're empty of people, but show signs of recent or intended human presence. They're well lit, but with artificial light that creates harsh shadows and eliminates the variations of natural illumination. They're clean and maintained, but somehow feel abandoned or wrong. They show familiar architectural elements, but in configurations or contexts that feel strange. They capture spaces during times or in conditions when you don't normally experience them, creating disjunction between what the space is supposed to be and what it is in the captured moment. The psychological explanation centers on evolutionary responses to environmental cues. Humans evolved to find emptiness threatening. In ancestral environments, being alone or encountering empty spaces that should contain people might indicate danger, might mean predators have scared away the group, might suggest contamination or threat that others have fled from. Modern liminal spaces trigger these ancient responses because they present environmental incongruity. Spaces clearly designed for many people but containing none. Locations that exist specifically for human activity, but that are experienced in states where that activity has ceased or hasn't begun, creating a mismatch between expectation and reality that our threat detection systems interpret as potentially dangerous, even though rational assessment identifies no specific threat. The lighting in liminal spaces contributes significantly to their unsettling quality. Fluorescent lights produce constant, shadowless illumination that eliminates the variations and movements that natural light creates. This unchanging quality makes time feel suspended, makes it difficult to gauge how long you've been in the space, creates an eternal present moment that's disorienting because human consciousness normally tracks time partly through light changes. The specific frequency and quality of fluorescent light may also affect consciousness directly. Studies have shown that certain lighting frequencies can influence mood, cognitive function, and even produce subtle perceptual anomalies. Though whether this explains the liminal space effect or merely contributes to it remains unclear. The architecture of liminality has common elements: long hallways that create forced perspective, making distances hard to judge, repetitive patterns that make navigation and spatial memory difficult, layouts that prioritize movement flow rather than destination comfort, materials like tile and concrete that create acoustic properties where sound behaves strangely, extensive use of right angles, and standardized dimensions that make everything feel manufactured and artificial. These design choices make sense for their intended functions. Airports and hotels need to move people efficiently. Parking structures need to maximize space. But when experienced without the crowds and activity that justify them, the design becomes oppressive, becomes visible as infrastructure rather than environment, becomes the skeleton of purpose without the flesh of actual human use. The temporal dimension is crucial. Liminal spaces feel most wrong when experienced at the wrong time, encountering them at 3 a.m., or during hours when they should be populated but aren't, when you're the only person present in a space designed for hundreds or thousands. when the normal schedule that regulates these spaces has been suspended and you're experiencing them outside their intended temporal context. This temporal wrongness compounds the spatial wrongness, creating a sense that you've slipped between the cracks of normal time, that you're experiencing reality in a mode that isn't supposed to be accessible, that the rules might be different here in this empty at the wrong time version of a space that exists differently when properly populated. The connection to dreams and unconscious imagery is frequently noted. Liminal spaces resemble environments that appear in dreams. Endless hallways, empty familiar locations, transitional spaces where you're trying to get somewhere but never quite arrive. Whether liminal spaces feel wrong because they resemble dream architecture, or whether dreams include liminal spaces because they represent psychologically significant transitional states is unclear. But the overlap suggests these spaces touch something deep in human consciousness, represent psychological states as much as physical locations, embody the anxiety of being between, of not quite being anywhere, of existing in transition. The backrooms phenomenon emerged directly from liminal space aesthetics, a collaborative fiction describing infinite levels of empty yellow rooms with water-stained carpet and buzzing fluorescent lights that exist behind or underneath normal reality, that you can accidentally glitch into by no-clipping through reality's boundaries, where you wander forever through procedurally generated emptiness, occasionally encountering entities or other lost people. The backrooms represent liminal space anxiety, taken to its extreme, the transitional space becoming permanent, the place you're not supposed to stay becoming the only place you can be, the wrongness of liminality becoming your entire reality. The fact that this concept resonated so powerfully across internet culture suggests that many people recognize the specific dread that liminal spaces produce, relate to the idea that the wrong kind of empty space can feel like you've left normal reality entirely. The nostalgia element in liminal spaces is paradoxical. Images of empty malls, abandoned playgrounds, old computer labs, unused pool areas, vintage hotel interiors produce simultaneous unease and longing, suggesting that liminal spaces trigger memories of childhood or past experiences, but filtered through temporal distance that makes them feel wrong. You remember being in these kinds of places when they were functioning and occupied, and seeing them empty creates cognitive dissonance between memory and present perception, between the vital, busy place you remember and the hollow, empty version you're seeing, suggesting that all spaces eventually become liminal, that everything ends up abandoned and empty, that the places we remember are already gone, even if structures that resemble them still physically exist. The commercial spaces are particularly powerful as liminal locations because they exist to serve capitalist functions of exchange and consumption. And when those functions cease, when the stores are empty and the registers are unmanned and the products are absent, what remains is naked infrastructure, the mechanisms of commerce visible without the activity that justifies them. Dead malls, empty retail spaces, shuttered shopping centers become monuments to failed enterprise, to the temporariness of economic structures, to the fact that places built to seem permanent and vital can become obsolete and abandoned within decades or even years, their architectural bones remaining long after their purpose has disappeared. Educational spaces carry similar weight. Empty schools, abandoned classrooms, unused gymnasiums feel wrong because these spaces are defined entirely by the students who should occupy them, by the learning and activity that should fill them. Without those human purposes, the spaces become hollow shells, and encountering them empty feels like witnessing something that's died, like standing in a body that no longer contains life. The institutional quality of educational architecture, the standardization and functionality, becomes oppressive when the institution isn't functioning. when you're present in the infrastructure without the human activity that animates it. Transportation infrastructure might be the purest form of liminal space, places that literally exist only to facilitate movement between destinations that have no purpose beyond transition. Airport terminals, train stations, subway platforms, highway rest stops, parking structures are designed never to be destinations, always to be passed through, and being present in them feels fundamentally temporary and unstable, even under normal populated conditions. When empty or experienced during off hours, these spaces intensify their inherent liminality, become extremely pure versions of in-betweenness, places where you're neither where you were nor where you're going, suspended in transit, existing in a state that's by definition temporary and transitional. The geographical component affects liminal space perception. The American landscape, with its sprawling suburbs, strip malls, highway systems, and standardized commercial architecture, repeated identically across thousands of locations, produces liminal aesthetics more readily than older, more varied architectural environments. The newness and standardization mean you could be anywhere or nowhere. Landmark and place-specific identity are reduced. Everything looks like everything else, and this generic quality makes the spaces feel unreal, makes them feel like sets or simulations, rather than actual places with history and specificity. When emptied of people, these genericized landscapes become supremely liminal, become the architecture of nowhere, of standardization and repetition, creating spaces that exist more as concepts than as actual lived places. The horror dimension of liminal spaces draws on their inherent wrongness. Horror fiction and games increasingly use liminal aesthetics because these spaces naturally produce unease, provide settings where the normal rules feel suspended, where threat feels possible, even though nothing overtly threatening is present. The empty space itself becomes the threat, or rather the potential of the empty space. The fact that it could contain anything, because you can't see what's around the next identical corner, can't predict what might emerge from the transitional emptiness that surrounds you. The experience of being in liminal spaces varies individually. Some people are highly sensitive to the disorienting, disturbing qualities of these environments, feel intense wrongness and desire to leave, experience actual anxiety or distress when trapped in liminal conditions. Others notice the strangeness, but aren't particularly disturbed, can navigate and occupy transitional spaces without significant psychological impact. This variation might relate to different threat sensitivity, to how strongly individual nervous systems respond to environmental incongruity, to whether personal history or trauma makes empty or transitional spaces particularly triggering. The pandemic intensified global experience of liminality. Familiar spaces became empty or reconfigured. Streets and stores and public places that should have been populated stood vacant. The normal rhythms of activity were suspended, and people worldwide experienced their environments in liminal states, seeing them at the wrong times in the wrong conditions, witnessing emptiness where crowds should have been. This collective experience of seeing our environments in states they weren't supposed to be in, of experiencing the infrastructure of normal life without the activity that animates it, created widespread recognition of what liminal spaces feel like, of that wrongness that comes from being present in places that are functioning incorrectly, that are showing their bones, that are empty when they shouldn't be. Whether liminal spaces are purely psychological phenomenon, whether they're locations where something genuinely strange occurs because of their transitional nature, whether they're places where reality is thinner or where consciousness behaves differently, or whether they simply represent human sensitivity to environmental wrongness and evolutionary responses to emptiness. The experience remains consistent across millions of people who recognize immediately what liminal aesthetics capture, who feel the wrongness in images of empty hallways and abandoned malls, who understand without explanation why certain empty places feel not just lonely, but actively wrong. Feel not just vacant, but threatening. Feel not just transitional, but like you've stepped outside normal time and space into a version of reality that shouldn't be accessible, that you've somehow glitched into. Like the backrooms concept describes, finding yourself in spaces that exist, but that you're not supposed to occupy, that have purposes, but that those purposes don't include you being there right now, in these conditions, making you a trespasser, not in the legal sense, but in a deeper sense. A person present in spaces and times that the architecture and purpose of these places never intended for occupation, making you wrong for being there as much as the place is wrong for being empty, creating mutual wrongness that produces the discomfort and unease and vague dread that characterizes liminal space experience, that makes you want to move quickly through and out of these transitional zones, that makes you understand why these are places to pass through, not to remain in. Why staying in liminal spaces for extended periods feels like tempting something, like remaining in a state that's inherently unstable, like existing in a crack in reality that might close while you're still in it, trapping you in liminality, in the state of betweenness, in the architectural emptiness that was never meant for extended human occupation, in the fluorescent lit hallways that go nowhere and everywhere, in the parking garages that contain only echoes, in the abandoned mall where everything is maintained but nothing is alive, in the hotel corridor at 3 a.m. where you're the only guest and the carpet pattern repeats infinitely in both directions, in the liminal spaces that exist throughout our built environment, waiting empty and humming and wrong for those moments when someone encounters them outside their proper context and feels for an instant that reality has thinned, that the boundaries have weakened, that they've stepped somewhere they weren't supposed to be, somewhere between where they were and where they're going, somewhere that exists only to be passed through, but where they've somehow stopped, frozen in transition, suspended in the wrongness of liminal space, where time feels stuck and direction feels uncertain, and the normal rules of being somewhere don't quite apply, because you're not really somewhere. You're between. You're in the hallway between rooms, in the stairwell between floors, in the terminal between departures, in the space that has no identity except as passage, in the architecture of pure transition that when encountered empty reveals itself as the stage said it always was, as the infrastructure without the activity, as the bones of purpose without the flesh of human use, as liminal, as wrong, as the places that feel wrong precisely because they're places that shouldn't feel like anything, that should be invisible in their transitional function, that become visible only when something goes wrong, when you're there at the wrong time, or the space is empty when it should be full, or you're alone when you should be accompanied by the crowds that justify these vast commercial and institutional spaces, leaving you standing in wrongness, in liminality, in the uncomfortable recognition that the places we build and move through every day can transform into something deeply unsettling, something that triggers ancient fears and modern anxieties, something that makes us understand viscerally that certain empty places feel wrong because they are wrong, are places that exist outside proper occupation, are spaces we were never meant to really see or know. We're only meant to pass through without thinking, without looking too closely, without noticing how strange they are, how empty they can be, how deeply wrong they feel when you're present in them in the wrong way at the wrong time, experiencing liminality, not as quick transition, but as prolonged state, not as passing through, but as being stuck in the in-between, in the spaces that connect, but that aren't themselves destinations, that facilitate movement, but that aren't places, that exist but don't belong, that feel wrong because they are wrong, liminal spaces where reality shows its seams and human consciousness recognizes something it's not supposed to see. The emptiness beneath occupation, the silence beneath noise, the wrongness beneath the functional surfaces we navigate daily, without ever quite acknowledging how strange these transitional spaces actually are, until we encounter them empty and realize with discomfort that we've been passing through wrong places our entire lives without ever quite noticing, until that moment when the space is empty and the lights are humming and we're alone, and suddenly the wrongness is unavoidable, is present, is all there is. Project Preserve, Destiny, Looking Glass Technology, and Seeing the Future. In the deepest levels of classified research, beyond what congressional oversight reaches, beyond what even most military personnel know exists, there allegedly sits a device that violates everything we understand about time, causality, and the fixed nature of reality. It's called Looking Glass, and according to whistleblowers who've risked everything to speak about it, this technology allows operators to view probable futures with enough clarity and detail that decisions affecting millions of lives are being made based on what the device shows. Not predictions, not forecasts derived from data analysis. Actual visual access to what will happen or what might happen, presented as scenes that can be observed, recorded, and studied. The implications are so profound that if the technology exists and works even partially as described, then everything you believe about free will, determinism, and humanity's trajectory through time needs revision. We might be living in a timeline that's already been viewed, decisions made by people who've seen the consequences before choosing, reality itself bent toward outcomes someone decided were preferable after watching the alternatives play out. The name Project Preserve Destiny suggests the purpose explicitly. Not just seeing the future, but preserving a specific version of it, guiding events toward desired outcomes while avoiding timelines that lead to catastrophe or scenarios the controllers find unacceptable. The project allegedly began decades ago, possibly as an extension of work that occurred during the Philadelphia experiment and the Montauk Project. Research into electromagnetic manipulation of time and consciousness that was never publicly acknowledged, but produced results significant enough to warrant continued development in deeper black programs. By the time Looking Glass became operational, the technology had supposedly advanced to the point where viewing future timelines was reliable enough to base policy decisions on what operators saw. The device itself is described through fragmented testimony from people who claim to have seen it or worked with it. A chair similar to descriptions from Montauk, where an operator sits surrounded by technology that interfaces with their consciousness. But instead of amplifying psychic abilities or projecting thoughts into reality, Looking Glass channels awareness forward through time, allowing the operator to perceive events that haven't happened yet. The viewing isn't passive like watching video. It's experiential, immersive, the operator existing in a future moment as if they're actually there, seeing through eyes that haven't opened yet, perceiving details with clarity that makes the experience indistinguishable from present reality. Dan Burish is the name most associated with Looking Glass testimony. He claims to have worked as a microbiologist on classified projects and gained access to information about the technology through his security clearance and project involvement. According to Burish, Looking Glass doesn't show a single fixed future, but rather displays probable timelines, branches that extend from present decision points. The operators can navigate between these probability streams, examining different versions of what might occur based on specific choices made in the present. It's not fortune-telling, it's systematic exploration of consequence space, mapping how present actions ripple forward through time and manifest in different outcomes depending on which path is chosen. The technology allegedly operates through manipulating what physicists would call the quantum foam, the seething probability field that underlies space-time at the smallest scales. by creating specific electromagnetic field configurations and interfacing human consciousness with these fields. Looking Glass somehow allows awareness to extend beyond the present moment and sample information from states that exist in probability but haven't yet collapsed into experienced reality. It sounds like science fiction, but quantum mechanics already acknowledges that particles exist in superposition of states until observed, and that information seems to flow backward through time in ways that violate our intuitive understanding of cause and effect. Looking Glass would be weaponized application of these principles, consciousness used as the observation mechanism to sample futures before they become present. What makes Burrish's testimony particularly unsettling is his claim that operators saw something consistent across multiple probable timelines, a convergence point that appears in nearly every future they examined. He describes it vaguely, referring to a cataclysmic event, or transition, occurring in the first few decades of the 21st century, visible across different probability branches, with only the details varying. Some timelines showed environmental catastrophe. Others showed technological singularity where artificial intelligence transcends human control. Some displayed war or pandemic or societal collapse. The specifics differed, but the presence of major disruption remained constant, as if certain futures are more probable than others, certain outcomes carrying such weight in the probability field that avoiding them requires enormous effort or might be impossible. This convergence creates a horrifying scenario for anyone with access to Looking Glass. If you can see that catastrophe is probable or inevitable across most timelines, what do you do with that information? Do you tell the public, causing panic and potentially triggering the very collapse you're trying to avoid? Do you remain silent and attempt to guide events subtly, making policy decisions designed to steer toward the least damaging timeline without revealing why you're making those choices? Or do you conclude that the future is fixed, that Looking Glass shows what will happen regardless of intervention, and use the technology only to prepare for the inevitable while maintaining control over the transition? Project Preserve Destiny allegedly represents the third option evolved into active strategy. The idea isn't preventing the convergence, but controlling it, ensuring it unfolds in a manner that preserves certain power structures, certain groups, certain outcomes deemed essential by whoever makes these decisions. If collapse is coming, then prepare underground facilities for continuity of government. If environmental catastrophe is inevitable, ensure resources are positioned where they'll be accessible afterward. If technological singularity approaches, try to steer the artificial intelligence toward alignment with human controllers, rather than allowing it to develop independently. The future is being stage managed based on what Looking Glass shows, reality sculpted toward the least worst option from a menu of probable disasters. But there's a deeper problem, a paradox that sits at the heart of Looking Glass technology. If you view a future and then make decisions based on what you saw, you've changed the conditions that led to that future, potentially making it less likely to occur. This creates a feedback loop where the act of looking affects what's being seen, where futures are constantly shifting based on how observers respond to previous observations. The technology might be chasing its own tail, viewing timelines that change every time someone acts on the information, creating a hall of mirrors where no future is stable because the present keeps adjusting based on forward-looking intelligence. Some testimony suggests Looking Glass began showing increasingly chaotic or unstable results as it was used more extensively, as if excessive viewing was damaging the timeline structure itself, or as if some force was actively interfering with the technology. Operators reported seeing futures that made no sense, paradoxical outcomes, or scenarios where human civilization simply disappeared with no clear cause. Was this the device malfunctioning, reaching limits of what consciousness can perceive when pushed too far forward? Was it evidence that excessive timeline manipulation creates instability? That too much looking causes probability waves to collapse unpredictably? Or was something on the other end of the temporal connection looking back, aware it was being observed from the past, taking actions to conceal or distort what the operators could see? There are also claims that multiple nations developed looking glass technology independently, or through shared research, meaning different groups might be viewing futures and making decisions that conflict, each trying to steer toward their preferred timeline. If the United States sees and prepares for one future, while Russia or China sees and prepares for another, their competing preparations could create conditions that make both futures less likely, while opening probability space for outcomes no one anticipated or wanted. The timeline becomes a battlefield where present actions are weapons aimed at killing undesirable futures while nurturing preferred ones. And human civilization is caught in the crossfire between competing visions of what should happen. The ethical implications are staggering. If a small group has access to future viewing technology, they possess power that makes traditional, political, military, or economic dominance look trivial by comparison. They know what will happen before it happens. They can position resources, make investments, start or prevent wars, all with knowledge of outcomes before anyone else even understands the full situation. This is beyond insider trading or tactical advantage. It's steering human destiny based on privileged information that no democratic process can access or contest. How do you vote against decisions made by people who've seen the consequences of not making them? How do you resist policy when its architects can claim, truthfully or not, that they viewed the alternatives, and this path leads to survival, while others lead to extinction? There's also the question of self-fulfilling prophecy at civilization scale. If Looking Glass consistently shows certain futures, and decisions are made to prepare for those futures, do the preparations themselves make the futures more likely? Building underground continuity facilities because you see collapse could redistribute resources in ways that make collapse more probable. Preparing for war because you see conflict could create tensions that manifest the war. Treating artificial intelligence as an existential threat because you saw it transcend control could lead to developmental approaches that ensure it views humanity as enemy when it finally emerges. The technology meant to help avoid catastrophe might be the mechanism ensuring it arrives. Burish also described seeing something in the far future that transcended the near-term convergence point, a version of humanity that had survived whatever transition occurs and evolved into something different. Beings with capabilities that seem almost supernatural from our perspective, existing in harmony with technologies and consciousness patterns we can't currently comprehend. He referred to these as future humans, or possibly extraterrestrials, who are actually our descendants, having developed time travel and returning to various points in their past, our present, to observe or guide events. The implication is that the Greys, the beings associated with UFO encounters and abduction phenomena, might not be aliens from other planets, but humans from our own future, come back to ensure their timeline remains stable, perhaps even using Looking Glass technology themselves to identify critical junctures where intervention is necessary. This creates a mind-bending possibility. If future humans are using time travel to influence the past, and present humans are using Looking Glass to view and manipulate probable futures, then reality is caught in a loop where cause and effect blur completely. The future is shaping the present, which creates the future, which sends agents back to shape the past, which becomes the present. Free will in this model is complicated beyond comprehension. Are we making choices or executing a script written by our future selves who already know what we'll choose? because they've already lived through it from the other end of time. The reason Project Preserve Destiny remains classified, if it exists, is obvious. Acknowledging Looking Glass technology would trigger immediate demand for access, for oversight, for public input into decisions being made based on future viewing. It would raise unanswerable questions about determinism and free will. It would create panic about whatever convergence point operators have identified, even if revealing that information might help avoid it. And most critically, it would expose that a very small group has been making choices that affect everyone based on information available only to them, effectively running shadow government that transcends normal political structures because it operates with knowledge pulled from tomorrow. The few who've spoken about Looking Glass have faced predictable responses: ridicule, dismissal, accusations of mental illness or fraud. Burish's testimony is questioned on every detail, his credentials disputed, his story picked apart by skeptics who note inconsistencies and lack of physical evidence. But the technology he describes is theoretically possible, according to some interpretations of quantum mechanics and general relativity. Closed time-like curves, retrocausality, quantum entanglement across time. These aren't science fiction concepts, but legitimate areas of theoretical physics. If the government invested in weaponizing these principles, the way they weaponized atomic physics, the result might look exactly like Looking Glass. And there are strange corroborations if you look for them. High-level strategic decisions that seem to make no sense based on publicly available information, but that in retrospect appear brilliant or prescient. Preparations for scenarios that seemed paranoid until they suddenly became relevant. Massive resource investments in projects whose purpose isn't clear until years later, when they turn out to be exactly what was needed. Are these just competent planning and lucky forecasting? Or are they decisions made by people who've already seen how things unfold, who know what's needed because they've watched versions of the future where those preparations saved civilizations, or where their absence led to collapse? The most disturbing aspect of Project Preserve Destiny isn't the technology itself, but what it suggests about reality. If the future can be viewed, then in some sense it already exists, laid out in probability space waiting to be experienced. But if viewing it changes it, then it exists in superposition, multiple versions simultaneously real until collapsed by observation and decision. We might be living in a curated timeline, a carefully selected branch chosen from thousands of alternatives because someone with access to Looking Glass decided this version was optimal or least catastrophic. Every major event, every seeming accident or coincidence could be the result of timeline management, reality steered towards specific outcomes by handlers who've seen what happens otherwise. And what about the convergence Burish described, the transition point visible across multiple futures? Are we approaching it now, living through the years when whatever Looking Glass operators saw decades ago is finally manifesting? Every crisis, every technological leap, every moment of instability could be part of the pattern they identified. Events unfolding according to what was viewed long before they occurred. If the operators saw this and made preparations, then whatever happens next has already been planned for, already been shaped by decisions made based on knowledge of outcomes that haven't arrived yet, but have already been observed by consciousness stretched forward through probability space. Project Preserve. Destiny represents the ultimate conspiracy. Not hidden events in the past, but hidden knowledge of the future, used to shape the present in ways we can't see or understand. Somewhere in a facility we'll never visit, using technology that won't be acknowledged, operators might still be sitting in that chair, consciousness extending forward through time, watching what comes, reporting to authorities who make decisions based on those reports, steering all of us toward futures they've selected from the alternatives they've been shown. We're passengers in a vehicle whose destination was determined by people who've already visited it, living through a timeline that's already been viewed and approved, heading toward whatever convergence point appears across the probability branches, unable to know if we're moving toward salvation or catastrophe. Because the people with access to that information decided long ago that we're better off not knowing, that the future must be preserved exactly as they've seen it, regardless of whether any of us would choose differently if given the chance to look through the glass ourselves.